Greta, your first climate strike was a lonely event a little over a year ago, and in the intervening time you have sparked the interest of millions, literally, of children around the globe, demanding action for climate change. What's your message to world leaders today?
There's not anything, because we're everything. Blinded by night, it's so bright when we shift into our being. The water that glows like dancing glass, our colors crimson. We flee, whilst the wild smoking horses swim among us. But where does the sea begin and the railroad end? Your children, consider your protection. Only the shape of our words can be seen and not heard.
Hello, thanks for joining us on this final of the 3 series of lectures brought to you by Sova Audio. So we've had, in the first lecture, we had the perception of sound, sonic perception. In the second lecture, we had sonic philosophies. And in this final lecture, we have sonic performance, the poetics of sound. And what we're going to try and cover in this is we'll be unpicking this performance as a poetic sound performance. We'll be looking at what poetry is and how can it be applied. We'll also be looking at a few different bits of text and theory which can help you in your practice cultivating these new ways of thinking, therefore new ways of working, performing and composing music. So that performance there we'll go through in a bit more detail, but it's called Only the Shape of Our Words Can Be Seen and Not Heard. So again, thanks very much for listening and thanks for joining me. So first, to get this kind of marginally embarrassing bit out of the way for me, just to let you know a little bit about myself, but I was an undergraduate student at LCC, UAL, around 8 or 9 years ago. I studied sonic arts, sound arts and design there, and then I went on to study postgraduate in music masters at Goldsmiths, again in sonic art. And since then I'm really developing new research proposals for a PhD, which I hope to start in September, which looks at ecomusicology, which is a really fascinating, relatively new field, looking at culture and nature, and how music fits into that as a form of kind of continuum or dialogical relationship. I'm looking at democratic research environments, especially with indigenous communities. I have a long-term project with an indigenous forest community in the rainforest, which I'll chat a little bit about later. And in that is looking at collaboration and co-directed research to try and replace historical, more hegemonic, more anthropological, ethnographic research, to kind of uncover research aims and questions together with people in communities in language that is transferable, and that's basically through the creation of music or art projects together. But I'll chat about that project a little bit more in more detail shortly after. I do see myself as an artist. I think it's important to point out that for me, paint, colour paints, acrylic paints, oil or alcohol inks are like different instruments to me, and I try and incorporate fine art with my performance. There's no boundaries, and often I try new instruments a week. I'll have an instrument for a week and I'll perform with it, and the same with some forms of sculpture, which I'll show you one later that I've done for a music release I've got coming out next month. But my background outside of the academic framework is I've been was a resident on NTS Radio for 5 years, and it was 100% live performances. And now, after 5 years, I've moved to Netil Radio. It's a fantastic new up-and-coming online radio station in London. Definitely check it out. It's going to be really developing in the next 12 months. And in that, I explore and test out new methods of performance which use, the incorporation, for example, of DJing and improvisation together, and just again cultivating conceptual ideas, developing these art projects, and that's every 2 months. And all my previous shows online if you want to check either of those out. I've released a lot of music on Dark Matters, my own label Coordinates, and I have an album on AD93 coming out next month. If you don't know that label, check them out. It's really interesting electronic stuff. So moving on to the interesting part. So when I was thinking about this lecture, I'm thinking, okay, well, the poetics of sound, or the poetics of sound performance, is that a little abstract? How can we break that down? So on this slide here, you see Lucia Dugislewski. Apologies for my poor pronunciation. Dugislewski, she comes up with this really nice way of summarising what poetics of sound performance may be. The first concern for all music in one way or another is to shatter the indifference of hearing, the callousness of sensibility, to create that moment of solution we call poetry, our rigidity dissolved when we occur reborn in a sense of hearing for the first time. So that's taken from one of her pieces. It was in the it was in the notes, music notes for one of her pieces, Tender Theatre Flight. And so Dugislewski was an American composer, studied at the Detroit Conservatoire, studied with famous pianist Greta Sultan and Edgar Varese, who we featured in, we spoke about in the first lecture. But she was very poetic in her performances and mainly chose to do, like myself, a live composition and performance. All my music I release is always a live recording. And she worked a lot in theatre, and again wouldn't repeat things, would always be looking for this, coming up with new ideas on the spot. She also done a lot of work with found sounds, and moving space theatre for everyday sounds was one that she had on, which used pots and pans, and this was in 1949. So, there was a bit of a movement with John Cage. For those who don't know, you'll probably know about some of his famous works, but if you read Silence, there's some really pretty inspiring stuff there about sound and how utilisation of all sound as music. But if we look at that quote there about what poetics of sound may be, it is still a little abstract. So let's break down that actual quote. So this first line, because this is what I do when I'm doing my research. I've done a lot of research outside of my field, a lot of interdisciplinary stuff, and I just don't understand. We'll have a deep understanding of what a lot is said often, so I try and break it down into small pieces as possible. So we have shatter the indifference of hearing, again in the context of what is the poetics of sound performance, or a poetic sound performance. Shatter the indifference of hearing. I kind of feel that Dugislewski's saying there's a lack of engaged listening, or not being interested, fully interested, maybe doing one or two other things, looking at your phone while listening to the performance at the start. So this is no one's fault, but this is just some attention to be drawn to. So there is this environment of listening needs to be there first before you can engage in a poetic sound performance. She then talks about the callousness of sensibility. And I kind of see this as maybe there's a disregard, sometimes can be a disregard to deeper meaningful experience during the performance as an audience, and also as a performer, because the audience and performer are operating as almost a collaboration, in my opinion. So it's kind of like, when we experience things, we talked about Pauline Oliveros before, you have reduced listening, you have deep listening, you have global listening when you're listening to the space, you have directed listening. When I was listening to the guitar line in that piece of music that Tony picked, and it's just setting up the right environment and having an understanding for an expectation, so you can create that deeper, meaningful experience when you experience sound or a performance, music performance. So then we have to create that moment of solution that we call poetry. So again, she's talking about solutions. So I see this as it's almost it's providing the answer by looking at these first two statements. So you need to be engaged environment. You need to be engaged listening. You need to be listening and performing with deeper levels of sensibility in order to create poetry. I think is that's how I interpret it. And then finally, our rigidity dissolved when we occur reborn in a sense of hearing for the first time. So it's like listening. In music, sometimes we talk about musical naivety or going back to the child state, occupying that state when you're playing and you're not bogged down by constructs or scales. And I often find myself in this almost purgatorial state, flipping between theory, non-theory and play. And I think this is what Dostoevsky is saying, is when we dissolve this rigidity and we open ourselves up for a new experience, we can go back to that kind of child state, and with a deeper, we can transcend our limitations, and often it's us that limits our experience. So we can come up with new ways to perform, new ways to listen, and have new experiences through poetic sound performance. So again, looking at what the poetics of sound performance is, this is a good opportunity to look at what some writers have said, and there's a couple of really, I think, quite communicative points and quotes. So we have T.S. Eliot: "Genuine poetry can communicate before it's understood." I guess just meditate upon that one. Sometimes do we listen to something and don't understand it? Or sometimes do we listen to something a second or third time and then some deeper meaning comes from that? Sometimes the abstract is the abstract and it's like silt in a river, and you need to stand still before it clears for you to understand it. Wallace Stevens said the poet is the priest of the invisible, which is quite a good way of describing it. So, some people talk about, transference or conduit, or, and some other poets talk about, Ginsberg said that it's like lying awake at night with your thoughts in your head and then making them public. It's about somehow conveying something. When we looked at when Pauline Oliveros in the last lecture, we looked at the different listening states. So, and we looked at feeling. Is there a feeling you have when you listen? Is there a sensation in your body? Are you thinking about anything? Is it triggering any kind of dream or visualization? So sonic thinking is a kind of theory around sound arts. This is quite interesting because it kind of challenges you in your thought process and your perception of what sound is. But Herzogenrath says about a duality of experienced resonance. So when we talk about resonance, you'll know that resonance is a physics thing in sound, a form of reverberation almost within certain frequencies that are multiplied in almost in doubling of frequencies. But there's also a resonance of philosophy or resonance of concepts, or like in Pauline Oliveros, there's a resonance of feeling in when you listen. There's something is resonating with you, and there's a duality of experience between the physics resonating with you and these concepts or feelings can often be precognition and just experienced. So he says, and this is in both the performer and the listener. I mean, it's a bit difficult for me here because I don't have you with me and I'm used to having an audience, but there's still enough people here to feel some kind of dialogical, a dialogue between the performer and the listener, which is part of the performance itself. So again, so relating to the previous definitions of poetry, Dostoevsky, artists and listeners' intention to engage on a deeper plane of sensibility. A poetic sound performance is a unique space-time event that allows the performer and audience to experience the world's resonances. So that's an interesting one to think about before you're working on any new musical projects. So we have a little bit here which moving a little bit into more philosophy, but I'm sure those of you are aware of Friedrich Nietzsche. If you're not, I highly recommend reading into Nietzsche. And he talks here, the concept of the philosopher, he tries to let all the sounds of the world reverberate in him and to place his comprehensive sound outside of himself into concepts. Whereas the artist lets the tones of the world resonate within him and projects them by means of percepts and affects. So this is interesting because Nietzsche is speaking about this, again, this reverberation, which is another word for another type of resonance. And he splits it between the philosopher, he separates the two. So the philosopher's thinking outside of themselves to generate new concepts, and the artist is intercepting and projecting these percepts and affects. I kind of think that there is an overlap between the two, but just to go into percepts and affects is Deleuze describes them as perceptions or feels that exist without the individual experience them. So almost independent beings themselves. So, for example, a harmony is an affect, or an art piece itself is an affect. They're things that might have involved me as the artist, you as the listener, but they exist in the space-time as something on their own. So it's a bit less than I'm going to make it's completely different from I'm going to make a good piece of music, and then present it. It's operating in a different kind of space. So that's an interesting thing to think about while I show you this next artwork. So I want you to kind of think about these things when you're looking at this artwork and experiencing this artwork. And again, put your headphones on because there is sound. This is a sound painting that I did with oils and different prints. And it's from a performance called The King of 100 Streams. And it's featuring Akari Yasuda, Japanese artist. So take a moment to consider what resonates with you in this piece, and then write it down in your listening journal if you've still got it from last time, or just make some notes. Again, it's for you. It's not needed to share, but it's for you to kind of reflect upon and bring a closer attachment to your feelings as you experience.
男性的な本質を知っていて、女性的な本質を保てば天下の谷となる。天下の谷となれば常に徳と離れることなく赤子の無垢に立ち返る。白い輝きを持つことを知っていても暗い影に休んじていれば天下の規範となる。天下の規範となれば上徳とたがうことなく究極の真理に至る。 何が栄誉であるかをわきまえ、甘んじて屈辱の位置に身を置けば、周囲の信望を集める谷となる。周囲の信望を集めれば、情徳が身について素朴な木材の状態に変える。木材は小さく削られると器になるが、聖人がこの木材を用いると人を統率する官庁となる。とかく木を切ったり削ったりも無理をしないのだ。Know the strength of man, but keep a woman's care. Be the stream of the universe. Being the stream of the universe, ever true and unswerving. Become as a little child once more. Know the white, but keep the black. Be an example to the world. Being an example to the world, ever true and unwavering. Return to the infinite. No honor, yet keep humility. Be the valley of the universe. Being the valley of the universe, ever true and resourceful. Return to the state of the uncarved block. When the block is carved, it becomes useful. When the sage uses it, he becomes the ruler. Thus, a great tailor cuts little.
So that's from 2018, and it's been interesting to reflect upon what resonated with you again, looking back to Pauline Oliveira's Deep Listening. Did you have any feelings? Did you experience any sensations in your body? Did it bring any thoughts to your mind? It's a piece which is available online if you want to check it out in full. It looks at the relationship between technology and nature, and it's based on passages of the Tao Te Ching. And the Tao Te Ching was wrote, I think it was around 60 or 70 BC, but correct me if I'm wrong. But it was, the story is that Lao Tzu, he was walking into the wilderness because he'd had enough or become disillusioned with humanity and wanted to walk into nature to effectively die. And before he did, some local religious sages stopped him and wrote down his words. And the book is incredible, but it's got passages of that, and it's called The King of 100 Streams, because he speaks about, the ocean is a king of 100 streams, but each individual stream is connected to that, large power. But so that's another example of a poetic performance. So coming on to what you heard at the start, that was a completely live, improvised performance, and I call it Only the Shape of Our Words Can Be Seen and Not Heard. So an introspective evocation of the interconnectivity between environmental change and collective experience. And that's a piece of artwork I've done for this project, which is acrylic paint, and the backing is made from reused cosmetic pots taken from the coast. And so really linking in all of this previous theoretical underpinning, how do we relate it with that performance at the start as an example? So, looking at what we just spoke about with Jugoslewski, we created that correct environment. So we cultivated the correct, what I like to refer to is an ecomusical interstice. An interstice is an intervening space where people come together and certain things happen to help trigger something in the audience and the performer. So in the first two lectures, we could only do this part by looking at how we perceive sound. Psychoacoustics, they were used in the performance using the binaural effect of the polar recordings, which are from Antarctica. So all the sound recordings you heard there from Antarctica, and they're of mammals and ice melting. That area is no longer with us. It's actually receded, and that glacier is no more. So in the second lecture, we looked at the transcendental event with Tony and shared altered states of consciousness during meditation and listening. So although it's difficult for us to do it, we're trying, and you can still, I believe, have that experience even through the digital ether. These all contribute to what Dugashevsky states, shatter the indifference of hearing and callous of sensibility to create that moment of solution we call poetry, which is what we created at the start. And also, as Nietzsche said, the world tones resonated with me with regards to this project, which is the sounds of a glacial retreat, climate ignorance, and ephemeral soundscape from Antarctica, where the electronic sounds are actually mammals. So what resonated with you in that performance? What feelings or what sensations did you have when you listened to that? So if we kind of unpick some of the creative decisions for that. So here we have the records, and we have the symbolism of the broken record, things not changing. There's a lot of talk about climate emergency and needing to change, and nothing gets changed. We're still going around on this broken record, almost tokenism. These two records are actually records of nature recordings on vinyl from the BBC. There's two overlaid, one's broken, and the rhythm of the broken record was the rhythm of the music piece. Again, like we're stuck in this circle of making the same mistakes and not changing. So the composed soundscape, which we alluded to before, uses sounds recorded on polar expedition, and they come from the Alfred Wegener Institute, who I've collaborated with on this project, which is going to be a music release as well. And they're a Centre for Polar and Marine Research, and they're doing a lot of the leading research into glacial retreat, ice cap melting, and sea temperature, rising sea temperature. So when you heard the introduction to the Greta Thunberg speech from the United Nations Climate Action Summit, which was 2019, all of Greta Thunberg's words had been removed and just the intonations in her voice. So it was all the phonetics and intonations and breaths in between the words, which is again a poignant use of, how the effect of words or the lack of effect of words, depending on your own interpretation. So there's a poem which was included in that, which is called "The Water That Glows Like Dancing Glass Cuts Crimson."
There's not anything, because we're everything. Blinded by night, it's so bright when we shift into our being. The water that glows like dancing glass. We flee, whilst the wild smoking horses swim among us. But where does the sea begin and the railroad end? Your children, consider your protection. Only the shape of our words can be seen and not heard.
So it's pretty abstract, and the reason for it's abstract is because of the original idea for this project came from my dreams. My dream, I often keep a note of my dreams, and I had a dream, some pretty crazy dreams about horses swimming in the glacier. And so I started to record my dreams, do meditations before sleeping. There's a book about these dream practices by Ione, who's a disciple of Pauline Oliveros, I believe. But I think it's called Listening in Dreams, and there's exercises that date back to Egyptian times that many ancient cultures used to consult their dreams for wisdom. And so there's things like reaffirming your dreams, writing notes. I saw a typewriter in my dream, a very specific one, and I bought a typewriter and then started typing things on it before going to sleep. These things about reaffirming the imagery in your dreams. And the more you do that, the more vivid and lucid the dreams become, until I started to see lines of text. And over the course of 3 months, I wrote those lines of text down. There's again, the themes of all the dreams were all of flooding and ice and these kind of things. So there's again some kind of subconscious or collective conscious connection between these kind of themes. And then with that, improvised flute, guitar, electronics, and I tried to perform, using and try to, kind of have different segments. About at the start, it might be a bit disorientating, maybe not pleasant, but then at the end, I wanted to show that we have an ability, or there is an ability to work together, interspecially with also with other communities, especially the rainforest communities, to make a change and help with get out of this broken record. So looking at this slide here is, again, so looking into the creative intent, coming back to this channeling the precepts and affects. So these things that exist outside of human beings that are identified and materialized or metabolized from the poetic sound performance process. But we have here the interstice in the middle. Again, that is that unique space-time event, like a performance, a concert, or what we're doing now, where there is the performer, there's information, and there is deep listening with sensibility or deeper experience. And then you can see there you have the composition, the evocation, the abstraction, and the communication. So I think really a poetry in sound is about the audience having a self-realization or evoking feeling them from themselves, as opposed to it being forced onto them, or it's something which everyone experiences their own individualized. It doesn't mean anything is wrong or not or right. It's just, it is kind of like something that is separate but all together. So we have polar sounds of mammals. The percussive sounds, apart from the record, were sounds of manufacturing and waste. There's some plastic. Had the Greta Thunberg speech, we had the dream poem, and the broken record, and they're all interlinked to create this eco-musical interstice, or this unique place where there can be some kind of new thought or change or inspiration for projects. It's all part of the same continuum. So just moving on a little bit to this term interstice, I first read it in Nicolas Bourriaud's Relational Aesthetics, which Nicolas Bourriaud is a really interesting art commentator, historian, critic. But again, it's kind of bordering on this philosophical perspective. But I see, I perceive, I comment, and I evolve in a unique space and time. So that's what he means by this interstice. So the performance is an opportunity, along with a poetic performance, to invoke self-reflexivity, so your own feeling about your own effect on your consumer responsibilities, consumption, or your own habitual choices to, you know, for example, to reject industries that contribute to the destruction of the climate. Or, you know, I mean, one powerful thing for me listening to that is playing the flute along to the sounds of whales and seals that are no longer there. And that is, I'm part of, you know, my resonance as an individual, and you could very much have different resonance. But, you know, this concept of interstice is an empowering space where individuals experience their own perceptions and self-realization, which I do believe is a more inclusive language and more powerful in stimulating change, not directing it, without agenda, without it being forced. And it can also be experienced on many levels of sensibility. I've had many performances where people just like the sounds, and then some people who read all about the projects and are really into the information that's associated with it. And it's just like a depth of a pool. You can go as deep as you want, and it's still, you know, you will still have sensation, feeling, thoughts when you experience it on different levels of sensibility. So this interstice he speaks about, we've referenced this in the two previous lectures about the spectacular representation which is required, which I asked both of our previous guests. Bourriaud uses this term, the scene of spectacle, and it's linked in with Guy Debord and some of that stuff, but he asserts that, Bourriaud asserts that humans have now relinquished direct experience in favour of spectacular representation. And Harris in The Guardian kind of elucidates it well and states, the spectacle is much more than something at which we passively gaze. It increasingly defines our perception of life itself. So that's a pretty deep statement, but the scene of spectacle is more than just a music performance. It's this whole continuum of things that can lead to a deep experience, which can lead to changes of perception and thought and new ideas. So that was from a project I did with the indigenous Wampi from the Amazonas rainforest. I went and spent some time with them. It's a pretty big project, so if you want to read more about it, it's all online on my website. But the project's called Los Bosquecinos, which is people of the forest. They're a forest community, and they're a very special community. They have a deep connection with nature and their surroundings. And the song you heard at the start in Wampi's, their indigenous language, is called a nampet, and the nampets are all about animals, but from the first person. So it'll be I'm a fish in the river. I need to look after my home. I want to ensure that my family are safe and these things. So they've got these ancient songs that are all from the perspective of an animal. So they have this perspective, they call it perspectivism. It's multinaturalism. They believe that humanity is an exclusive trait to all, it isn't exclusive to humans, it's all living creatures and some in plants as well. That humanity is more of a behaviour than, just attached to us. I did so when we look at these, how I break it down, the scene of the spectrum, and underneath you've got the Nature-Culture-Climate-Continuum. I didn't want to give too much context on that because I thought it might be interesting for you to listen and come up with your own deductions on there. But the scene of the spectacle was a live performance at Freerotation festival in Wales, and it was also broadcast on NTS radio. And really, that's, I guess, mapping my mind on, these things. I find it helpful to get clarity in what the project is. But you can see in the scene of the spectacle there, you've got nature, climate and culture, these interlinked things. And my research, which is going to be going, I created a performance as research methodology called the Nature-Culture-Climate-Continuum, and it's about it's based on ecomusicology, which is the study of music, nature, culture at the time of environmental crisis, and the Nature-Culture-Climate-Continuum is a way to invoke different feelings in an audience, but it's through the evocation of the dialogical mechanisms within climate change. So we're all a part of it. So the sounds of the rainforest, the music from the indigenous communities, and in the sound in industrialised cities where the vast majority of anthropogenic climate change is coming from. So this is how I kind of conceptualise these things. But the whole performance is an hour and 20 minutes, is online, and it's a collaboration between the Wampis. They selected the field recordings and what we would do when we were out in the rainforest. And that's going to be released actually in a few months, and all the money is going to go towards helping the community. I've already paid for a new school from the first iteration, so it's a not-for-profit project, and it's definitely mutually beneficial. So we're talking about this removal of the traditional researchee into this co-directed research where we work on things together. That's all going really well, but that'll be released in a couple of months' time. So just to kind of summarise everything then, the Poetics of Sound, to wrap it all up. So again, Dugoslavsky, first concern of music in one way is to shout the indifference of hearing. So, you've got to cultivate the right environment between both the performer and the audience, to create this unique moment in time. Again, the Poetics of Sound, genuine poetry could communicate before it's understood. Again, the understanding of what poetry is in writing and how that can be applied with sound. The duality of resonance, the resonance of feeling as well as the resonance of the sound itself. the channeling of percepts and affects as independent beings. That's a hard one to grip, but you know, these are all things that that will allow you as an artist to try and work in different ways than just following your own wishes and wants, or you know, which are a lot of these are directed by our subconscious, things we've had, experience we had growing up. But you know, by working in this poetic way, it can allow us to, you know, work in different ways, challenge ourselves as musicians, and also, you know, connect with people on a deep level, which is, you know, the most precious thing that I think we can do as artists. So conceptualization to cultivate an ecomusical interstice. Again, that's just the performance space with people in it. And after the performance, they'll be talking about what you did, whether they liked it, they didn't like it, what ideas they had, what feelings they had. And this cultivates maybe one or two people going off and doing something similar. And so this is what the interstice can do. It can create a ripple, a pebble in the pond type effect. And the scene of the spectacle, which is Bourriaud, which we were speaking about. Humans require a spectacular representation of something in order for it to be influenceable, due to the development of media. And performance as research. I know you'll be maybe looking into your dissertation and looking into your writing. You know, the performance as research is a really underrated methodology, and there's some really great books on it. Have a look at Tim Ingold and people like that. But it's a really good way of exploring, I think, discourse in writing. And feel free to contact me. Both my BA and MS theses are available online. You can read and see how I've kind of went about it. And that's it. So just say thanks very much for joining these lectures. It's been a pleasure. Feel free to get in touch with me if you want just to chat about projects. I've done quite a lot of work mentoring students with project development and stuff. So you can hit me up via my website, which is aboutfacemusic.co.uk, and wishing you all the best with your final year.